Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar on sponsoring Sudanese refugees under the temporary public policy for groups of 5 and community sponsors. My name is Sunit, and I am here with my colleague Helena, and we will be your hosts for the session today. We're both from an organization called the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, and we are an organization that is funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada to provide training and information, as well as support to refugee sponsors across the country. We'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the main offices of Catholic Cross-Cultural Services, which is the agency that the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program is based at, is on the traditional territories of many nations, including those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We would also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and also that our team, which is across Canada, is hosted on the lands of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. So like I said, we, Helena and I, are from an organization called the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. We are a IRCC-funded organization, and our mandate is to support refugee sponsors across the country. So we have offices in every province, with the exception of Quebec. And some of the things that we do are live trainings and workshops, like the one you're attending now. We have online training courses through our Moodle platform that you can take. We provide information and guidance to people interested in refugee sponsorship. We produce training materials and guides. And one of our main roles is information sharing and updates, given that the policy and program requirements for refugee sponsorship change quite often. And we also provide case support and respond to individual inquiries. So if you go to our website, rstp.ca, you can find the contact details of our team, and you're welcome to contact us if you have any questions, either related to this temporary public policy or any general questions related to refugee sponsorship. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to start off by looking at what the temporary public policy is. We'll then move on to who can be sponsored under the temporary public policy. We'll look at who can sponsor refugees under this policy. We'll take a short break. And then in the second half of the session, we'll look at what are the financial and settlement responsibilities of sponsors who are sponsoring refugees under this temporary public policy. And we will also look at how you prepare an application package and how you submit your application package via IRCC's Permanent Residence Portal. So let's start off by understanding what the temporary public policy is. So we are all working from the same level of understanding before we start looking into who can sponsor refugees and who can be sponsored under the public policy. So the temporary public policy was created to allow the sponsorship of refugees who are Sudanese nationals without the need to have or provide a copy of their refugee status document. So if you're familiar with refugee sponsorship, you know that groups of 5 and community sponsors, when there wasn't a temporary pause in them being able to sponsor, they needed to include a copy of the refugee's refugee status document with the application package. And only those applications that included a copy of the refugee's refugee status document were processed by IRCC if you were a group of 5 or a community sponsor. This temporary public policy waives the refugee status document requirement. So it allows groups of 5 and community sponsors to, first of all, sponsor refugees during this time when there is a temporary pause in effect for group of 5 and community sponsor applications. But it also allows groups of 5 and community sponsors to sponsor refugees without proof of refugee status, because we know, depending on what country the refugees are in, it can be difficult for refugees to get proof of refugee status. Now, that's not to say that you can only sponsor refugees that do not have refugee status under this temporary public policy. You can still sponsor refugees that have refugee status. So if the person or the family that you're looking to sponsor, they have a refugee status document, you can still sponsor them under this temporary public policy, but it's not a mandatory requirement. If the refugees that you want to sponsor don't have a document, then you can sponsor them using this public policy. So that's what the temporary public policy is. It was created to facilitate the sponsorship of refugees who are Sudanese nationals by groups of 5 and community sponsors without them needing to provide a copy of their refugee status document with the application package. Now, IRCC will start accepting applications under this public policy from April 30th, 2025 onwards. So at the end of this month, this is when you can start submitting applications. So right now, at this moment, you cannot submit an application under this temporary public policy. IRCC will start accepting applications from April 30th onwards, and the temporary public policy will either run until December 31st, 2025, or until IRCC has accepted 160 applications into processing. So this is something very important to keep in mind. The temporary public policy is open from April 30th, so that's when you can start submitting applications to IRCC using this temporary public policy, and it will end either once IRCC has accepted 160 applications into processing, or it will run until December 31st, 2025, whichever comes first. So it could be the case that the program opens on April 30th, you start submitting your applications, and then IRCC reaches the 160 application threshold, and then they close the program and they close the temporary public policy before December 31st. So IRCC will accept applications from April 30th onwards until they've received 160 applications, or up until December 31st, 2025, whichever comes first. Now, this temporary public policy is specifically for refugees from Sudan. So the refugees need to be Sudanese nationals. If you are looking to sponsor refugees of other nationalities that are currently in Sudan, so for example, Ethiopian, Eritrean nationals, or any other nationals that may be in Sudan, given that Sudan hosts a lot of refugees from other countries, you cannot sponsor them under this temporary public policy. This temporary public policy is specifically for Sudanese nationals who are refugees. So Sudanese nationals who are no longer in Sudan and were displaced because of the armed conflict. You cannot sponsor refugees of other nationalities that are currently in Sudan and may be affected by the conflict via this temporary public policy. You also cannot sponsor South Sudanese nationals. So if you remember, Sudan and South Sudan used to be one country, but they are now separate countries. You can only sponsor Sudanese nationals under this temporary public policy. You cannot sponsor South Sudanese nationals under the temporary public policy. You also cannot sponsor refugees of other nationalities. So some of you may be aware, but there is currently a temporary pause in effect on new Group of 5 and community sponsor applications until December 31st, 2025. This temporary public policy is an exemption to that pause, but again, this public policy is specifically for Sudanese refugees. You cannot sponsor refugees of other nationalities via this temporary public policy. If you remember, we said that the temporary public policy will run from April 30th, 2025 until December 31st, 2025, or until IRCC has accepted 160 applications into processing, whichever comes first. So if, for example, the program opens on April 30th, 2025, and IRCC does not accept 160 applications into processing until they reach that number, or until December 31st comes around, whichever comes first, that is when the temporary public policy will close. The important thing to remember here is when we say 160 applications, we are referring to application packages. So it's not 160 people, because as we'll look into in a moment when we talk about who can go on one application. You can have multiple people on an application, provided they meet IRCC's definition of a family. And we'll look at that in a couple of slides. So even though it's 160 applications, number of people that will be sponsored via this temporary public policy will be a lot more, because you could have multiple people on an application. So it's 160 application packages. And we will talk more about who qualifies as a family member and who can go on the same application as the principal applicant in a few slides. But just keep in mind, it's not 160 people, it's 160 applications. And potentially that means it's a couple of hundred, potentially even several hundred people that can be sponsored under this temporary public policy, because you can have multiple people on an application package, provided they meet IRCC's definition of a family. So let's look at who can be included on the same application package. And again, remember, 160 applications does not mean 160 people, because on the same application package, you would also have the principal applicant. And the principal applicant is typically the person that has the strongest refugee story, or the person that meets the requirements that we're going to look into in a moment. So on every application, you're going to have a main applicant, you're going to have the principal applicant. On the same application package, the principal applicant can put their spouse or common law partner. So a spouse is like someone that the principal applicant is married to. A common law partner is somebody that the principal applicant is in a relationship with and has lived together with for at least 12 months. So the principal applicant's spouse or common law partner can go on the same application. And then the dependent children of both the principal applicant or their spouse or partner can also go on the same application. So as you can see here, you can have multiple people on an application package. A couple of key things before we move on. In order to qualify as a dependent child, the children have to be under the age of 22 at the time the application is submitted to IRCC. So in order to qualify as a dependent child, the children have to be under the age of 22, and they also have to be not married. If a child is under the age of 22 but married, they do not qualify as a dependent child because they are married. So if you are working with families that do have children that are under the age of 22 and married, please make sure you have a separate application package for them. There is one exemption to when a child that is 22 or older can go on the same application package as the principal applicant. And that is when the child has a physical or mental health condition and they are dependent on the rest of their family because of this medical condition. That's the only situation under which a child that is over the age of 22 can go on the same application as their parents. If they are over the age of 22 and they don't meet that exemption, they need to have a separate application package. If they are under the age of 22 and they are married, they also need to have their own separate application package. So this is who can go on one application package. Anybody that doesn't meet this definition of a family, so for example, let's say the principal applicant's parents, the principal applicant's siblings, the principal applicant's cousins, uncles, aunts, they do not meet this definition of a family, so they need to have their own separate application package. So please keep this definition of a family in mind when you're putting your application packages together, because this is who can go on the same application package. If you include somebody that does not meet this definition of a family on the application package, IRCC will return the application. So for example, if you include a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a parent that does not meet this definition of a family, the application will not be processed by IRCC. So it's very important to make sure you keep this definition of a family in mind when you're preparing your application package. Now, let's talk a bit more about de facto dependents. So again, as a reminder, on the same application package, you can have the principal applicant's spouse or partner, any of the principal applicant's dependent children, So they must be under the age of 22 and unmarried. And you can also have a dependent child of a dependent child. So let's say, for example, the principal applicant has a son or daughter that is under the age of 22, and that son or daughter who is unmarried, is under the age of 22, also has their own child who is under the age of 22 and unmarried. They can be included on the application package. So effectively, the grandchild of the principal applicant can also go on the same application, provided they are under the age of 22 and unmarried, and that the dependent child of the principal applicant is also under the age of 22 and unmarried. Now, you may be sponsoring families who have minor children that they're looking after that are not necessarily their biological or legally adopted children. So, for example, you might be sponsoring a family that has a nephew or a niece or another child that is under the age of 18 that they're looking after because that child has either been separated from their parents or their parents' whereabouts are missing. Now, that child who is under the age of 18 and is not the biological or legally adopted child of the principal applicant, they cannot go on the same application as the rest of the family. They need to have a separate linked application, and we'll show you how to link applications in the second half of the session. They will need a separate linked application, and because they're under the age of 18, they would also need to be identified as a de facto dependent. And a de facto dependent is typically, generally, someone who's under the age of 18, so a minor, who is under the care of the principal applicant and their family, and they are emotionally and or financially dependent on the principal applicant and their family. If you are working with a case involving minors and there's a potential de facto dependent situation, please get in touch with us and we can talk through how you would structure the applications and things you need to keep in mind. So please get in touch with us if you have any questions about how to structure an application, because it's very important you keep in mind who can go on one application package when you're preparing the application, and also keep in mind that for anybody that doesn't meet ISCC's definition of a family, you need to have a separate application package. But like I said, Helena, myself, our colleagues, we're here to help you. So if you have any questions about how to structure an application, please get in touch with us. Our contact details will be on the last slide, and you're welcome to get in touch with us at any time. So before we start looking at the requirements that the refugees you are sponsoring need to meet, and also who can sponsor, so the requirements for the sponsors that are sponsoring under this temporary public policy, we just want to spend a bit of time talking more about the 160 applications that will be accepted into processing. So if you remember, a couple of slides ago, we said that this temporary public policy will run until 160 applications are accepted into processing, or until December 31st, 2025, whichever comes first. What ISCC means by 160 applications accepted into processing, it means applications that pass the initial screening to make sure that all of the relevant forms and supporting documents have been included and are complete so that they can be entered into processing. If a document or a form is missing, that application is considered to be incomplete and it will be returned to you. And a returned application does not count towards the 160 applications accepted into processing. So if you submit an application, there's a form or a document missing, ISCC will get back to you and say, hey, this form, this document is missing, we're returning the application to you, can you correct it and resubmit? If that happens, that application that you submitted has not been accepted into processing because it is not complete and does not count towards the 160 applications accepted into processing. If you submit an application, it's complete, it passes that initial screening that ISCC does, it enters into processing, but let's say either the refugee is ineligible for the temporary public policy or your group is ineligible to sponsor under the temporary public policy, the application will be rejected, and a rejected application uses up part of the 160 count. So a returned application does not count towards the 160 application count, but if an application is accepted into processing because it's complete and it passes that initial document screening, but it's rejected because either the refugees are ineligible or your sponsoring group is ineligible, that rejected application uses up part of the 160 count. So it's very important to make sure, first of all, your application is complete, because you don't want to submit an application only for it to be returned back to you. And secondly, you make sure that the refugees you're sponsoring are eligible to be sponsored under this temporary public policy, and that your sponsoring group and your fellow sponsors are also eligible to be sponsors under this temporary public policy. If an application is returned to you, you might still have time to reapply if the 160 count isn't reached, or if it's returned to you before December 31st, 2025. But we want to avoid that situation because it's extra pressure on you and your sponsors, as well as the refugee that you're sponsoring, which is why we're doing these training sessions, to make sure, to the best of your ability, you submit a complete application that is likely to be successful and is not going to be returned or rejected. And like I said, we're here to help. Helena, myself, our colleagues, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, because you're not able to submit applications until April 30th. So you still have a couple of weeks to get ready. And if you need to reach out, if you have questions, if you want to run through case scenarios, or you have a particularly difficult case that you're working on, feel free to reach out. We're here to help and support you. So now that we've got all of the stuff related to the requirements of the temporary public policy out of the way, let's look at who can be sponsored under the temporary public policy. And when we say who can be sponsored, we're talking about the requirements that the refugees need to meet in order to be eligible for sponsorship. Because if you remember from the previous slide, if the refugees are not eligible for sponsorship, the application will be rejected. So let's look at the requirements that the refugees you're sponsoring have to meet in order to be eligible for sponsorship under the temporary public policy. So the first major requirement, or the first main requirement, is the refugees have to be Sudanese nationals that are outside of Sudan. So if somebody is a Sudanese national and they are still inside Sudan, they do not qualify and they are not eligible for this public policy. They need to be Sudanese nationals and they have to be outside of Sudan. Similarly, if they are not a Sudanese national, so if they are a national of another country, and regardless of whether they are inside or outside of Sudan, they are not eligible to be sponsored via this public policy. So please make sure you are only sponsoring and submitting applications for Sudanese nationals that are outside of Sudan. Now, the principal applicant on the application, so the main applicant on the application, if you remember that diagram that we looked at earlier, the principal applicant, the main applicant, has to meet one of two definitions, either the Convention Refugee Abroad Class definition or the Country of Asylum Class definition. And we will look at both of these definitions in detail on the next slide. So they need to meet one of these two refugee definitions that we use in Canada. They also need to have a sponsoring group in Canada. So they need to have a group of 5 or a community sponsor that's willing to sponsor them. And again, we'll look at the requirements for groups of 5 and community sponsors in the next section. They also need to demonstrate that they do not have a durable solution available to them. And we will explain what a durable solution is in the coming slides. The key thing to remember, like I mentioned earlier, is that it is only the principal applicant on the application that needs to meet these eligibility requirements. So it's only the principal applicant that needs to be a Sudanese national who is outside of Sudan. It's only the principal applicant that needs to meet either the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition or the country of asylum class definition. It's only the principal applicant that needs to demonstrate that they do not have a durable solution available to them. The principal applicant, as well as any of the principal applicant's family members who are included on the same application as them. So if you remember that diagram, you can include the principal applicant's spouse or common law partner, or any of their dependent children, so children that are under the age of 22 and unmarried, or a dependent child of a dependent child on the same application package. They only need to pass a security check, a criminal check, and a medical check. The principal applicant also needs to pass the security, criminal, and medical check. When it comes to security checks, ISCC will screen everybody on the application to ensure that they haven't engaged in any crimes against humanity, any acts of genocide, any war crimes, any acts of terrorism, any coups, or they'll also look to see whether they've been involved or associated with any groups that may have engaged in any of those activities. When it comes to the criminality check, you don't need to submit a copy of a criminal record check for the refugees. ISCC will run the criminal check on their end, and they are looking to see whether anybody in the application has any criminal convictions for offences that have a equivalent offence in Canada. So that's the key thing to remember. If someone has a criminal conviction for a criminal offence that has a equivalent offence in Canada, they will not be admissible to Canada. So for example, if somebody has a conviction for murder, burglary, robbery, sexual assault, all of those crimes have an equivalent offence in Canada, and they will most likely be found to be inadmissible to Canada, and the application will be refused. If, however, somebody has a criminal conviction for speaking out against the government or exercising their free speech, or because they were in a same-sex relationship, those are not crimes that have an equivalent offence in Canada, so they may still be admissible and still be allowed to come to Canada. It's only if someone has a conviction for a criminal offence that has an equivalent offence in Canada that the application will be refused. And then when it comes to the medical check, everybody on the application will be expected to attend a medical with a doctor that has been approved by ISCC to conduct medical examinations, and they have to pass that medical screening. And the doctor is basically looking to see whether anybody on the application has a medical condition that would put the Canadian public at risk. So for example, if somebody has Ebola or tuberculosis or another medical condition that puts the Canadian public or national security at risk, the application will most likely be refused because that person is inadmissible to Canada. If, on the other hand, somebody just has a regular medical condition such as like diabetes, or they have heart issue or asthma, if they have a medical condition that does not put the Canadian public or Canadian national security at risk, they will still be allowed to come to Canada and they will not be found inadmissible. So these are broadly the requirements that the refugees being sponsored under the temporary public policy have to meet. Now let's look at the two definitions in more detail. We're going to break down the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition and the country of asylum class definition in more detail, because it's very important that you only submit applications for a principal applicant that meets one of these two definitions, because if they don't, the application will be refused. So let's start off with the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition. The Convention Refugee Abroad class definition is kind of like your classic refugee definition. It's taken word for word from the Refugee Convention, from the United Nations Refugee Convention, and it's basically where somebody has left their home country or their country of habitual residence due to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or because of their political opinion. Now, when you're putting the application together, you'll see that there's some forms that the refugee that you're sponsoring or the refugees that you're sponsoring need to complete, and Helena will cover those in the second half of the presentation. But when you're putting the forms together and the refugees completing their forms, you don't need to specify which of the two definitions the principal applicant meets. You just need to explain the refugee story, but you need to screen the story and just read the story through to make sure that they meet either the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition or the country of asylum class definition. So the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition is where somebody has left their home country or their country of nationality due to a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, because they belong to a particular social group, or because of their political opinion. And they also need to demonstrate that they don't have a durable solution within a reasonable period of time. And when we talk about durable solutions, we're talking about the three main durable solutions that exist for refugees that have been displaced. We're talking about resettlement, local integration, and voluntary repatriation. So if the refugee has one of those three options available to them, they are not considered to be eligible for sponsorship to Canada. Resettlement is where somebody receives an offer of resettlement from another country. So for example, if somebody has an offer to be resettled to Australia or the UK, Sweden, any country that has a government-sponsored resettlement scheme, they are considered to have a durable solution. Voluntary repatriation is where it is safe for the principal applicant to return to their home country. So if there's been lasting and meaningful change in the principal applicant's home country, and it's safe for them to return to their home country, they are not considered to be eligible for sponsorship. And then the final durable solution is local integration, and that is where the refugee is outside their country of nationality or habitual residence, so they're in another country, and the situation in that country means that it's relatively safe for them to stay there. So they're not at risk of being deported back to their home country. They have some form of immigration status that allows them to stay in that country. They have the right to work. They have the ability to access government assistance and social assistance. They have freedom of movement. They're able to send their children to school. So if somebody is in a country and they have those rights and it's safe for them to stay there, they will most likely consider to be locally integrated and they will not be eligible for sponsorship to Canada. So this is the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition. They need to demonstrate, the principal applicant needs to demonstrate they have a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, because they belong to a particular social group, or because of their political opinion. And they also need to demonstrate that it's not safe for them to return to their home country. They don't have another offer of resettlement to another country, and they cannot stay and live safely in the country that they're currently in. Moving on to the country of asylum class definition. So this definition is more of an expanded refugee definition that we have in Canada. And this is where somebody has left their home country, so they've left their country of nationality or their country of habitual residence because they were seriously and personally affected by civil war, armed conflict, or massive human rights violations. So with the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition, the principal applicant has to demonstrate that they left their home country because of a well-founded fear of persecution for any one of those 5 reasons. But here, with the country of asylum class definition, the principal applicant has to demonstrate that they were seriously and personally affected either by civil war, armed conflict, or massive human rights violations. And they also need to demonstrate that they don't have a durable solution within a reasonable period of time. And it's the same 3 durable solutions. So they don't have an offer of resettlement to another country. They don't have the ability to return to their home country safely and live there safely and in dignity. And they also cannot stay in the country that they're currently in. So those are the country of asylum class and Convention Refugee Abroad class definitions. And like I said earlier, when you're completing the forms, when the refugees are completing the forms, they don't necessarily need to specify that I meet the country of asylum class definition or I meet the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition. They just need to provide their story, and then you just need to screen the application and make sure that their story fits one of these 2 definitions. Because if they don't fit one of these 2 definitions, the application will be rejected by ISCC. So this is a handy checklist that you can use. And like I said, this presentation is available to download via the GoToWebinar control panel. You should see a handouts tab and you can click on it, and there'll be 2 PDFs available to download, one of which is a copy of this presentation. If you don't see it, don't worry, we will email you a copy of this presentation once the session is done. But this is a handy checklist that you can use when you are preparing your application to make sure that the person you're sponsoring is eligible to be sponsored under this temporary public policy. So start off by asking, is the person a Sudanese national? If yes, is the person outside of Sudan? If yes, is the person unable to stay in the country that they're in long term? If they are, then they're not eligible to be sponsored. If they're not, can they return safely to Sudan? If they can, they are not eligible to be sponsored. If they cannot, do they have an offer of resettlement to another country? If they do, they are not eligible to be sponsored. If they don't, they can be sponsored. And then the final question you need to ask once you have their story is, do they meet either the country of asylum class definition or the Convention Refugee Abroad class definition? And remember, the refugees you sponsor, they do not need to have proof of refugee status. If they have it, great, but one of the key components of this temporary public policy is that the refugees being sponsored, the Sudanese refugees being sponsored, do not need to have refugee status. But remember, that doesn't exclude people that do have refugee status. You can still sponsor someone that has refugee status if they meet all of the requirements, but one of the key components of the temporary public policy is that it allows groups of 5 and community sponsors to sponsor refugees that do not have refugee status, provided they are Sudanese nationals and meet all of the requirements. So let's look at a couple of examples together, and then we'll look at the requirements for the sponsors that are sponsoring refugees under this temporary public policy. So we have this family of 4 here. We have Tariq, who is the father. We have Zara, who is his spouse. And then we have Umira and Aziz, who are their children. Now, Tariq and his family, they fled the conflict in Sudan, and they've been in Egypt for 2 months. They don't have a refugee status document, and they've received credible threats to their life, and they've continued to receive those threats since they've left Sudan. They're currently living in a difficult situation in Egypt. They have limited access to housing, health, education, and employment. Now, based on the information that we've looked at, based on the requirements for the temporary public policy, the definition of the Convention Refugee Abroad class, as well as the country of asylum class, as well as what a durable solution is and the 3 durable solutions, do you think Tariq and his family would be eligible to be sponsored under this public policy? And you can raise your hand and I will unmute you, and then you can share your response with everybody. Or alternatively, if you want, you can just put your response into the question box. So based on the limited information that we have, do you think Tariq and his family would qualify? And again, you can either raise your hand or put your response into the question box. So we'll pause here for a minute and just give you some time to think about this. Just looking at the question box, and yes, so there's many of you. Thank you for all of your responses. Many of you are saying that Tariq and his family would qualify under this program, and you're correct. They would qualify because they are Sudanese nationals who fled the conflict in Sudan. They are not currently in Sudan. They're in Egypt. They've been there for 2 months. They don't have a refugee status document, but that's okay. They don't need one under this temporary public policy. And they cannot return to Sudan because of the conflict and because they've continued to receive threats to their life and their family since they fled. And it's also, the situation in Egypt is not conducive for them to stay in Egypt because they have limited access to housing, health, education, and employment. And based on the limited information that we do have, Tariq and his family would most likely meet the country of asylum class definition because they have been seriously and personally affected by the armed conflict in Sudan. And they had to flee Sudan because of the armed conflict. So yes, Tariq, based on the limited information that we do have, and his family would qualify to be sponsored under this temporary public policy. So thank you to everybody that provided your input. Okay, let's look at one more case example, and then we'll look at the requirements for the refugees being sponsored. So in this example, we have Khalid and his wife and daughter are currently hiding in Sudan. So they had to leave their hometown because of the conflict in the country, and they're currently living in hiding with relatives in another town in Sudan. So based again on the limited information that we do have, please use the question box or you can raise your hand. Do you think Khalid and his family would qualify under this temporary public policy? So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about it and provide your responses. Okay, so your responses are coming in and everybody is saying no, and you're correct. And a couple of you said that they would not qualify because they're still currently living in Sudan. And again, you're completely right. So Khalid and his family, yes, they're Sudanese nationals, but they are still in Sudan. And because they are still in Sudan, they do not qualify. They need to be outside of Sudan in order to be eligible. It's one of the initial requirements of this temporary public policy is that the refugees have to be outside of Sudan in addition to being Sudanese nationals. So thank you everybody who responded and participated in this little exercise. So now that we've looked at the requirements for the refugees being sponsored, we're now going to look at the requirements that you have to meet. So the requirements that you as sponsors have to meet under this temporary public policy. So this temporary public policy specifically allows groups of 5 and community sponsors to sponsor Sudanese refugees who meet all of the requirements that we looked at. Now, you might be wondering what a group of 5 is, or you might already be familiar with a group of 5 and how it works, but we're just going to go through it together so we all have the same level of understanding. And we'll also do the same for community sponsors after. So a group of 5 is a group of at least 5 Canadian citizens or individuals that have permanent resident or Indian status. Now, the minimum number you need to have in a group of 5 is 5 individuals, and they also need to be at least 18 years of age, and they must live in the expected community of settlement. Now, when we use the term community of settlement, it means the town or the city that the refugee will live in on arrival in Canada. So, for example, if the refugee will be living in Victoria, BC on arrival, the group of 5 members all have to be living in Victoria. If the refugee was intending to live in Toronto when they arrive in Canada, Toronto is the expected community of settlement, so all of the group of 5 members must be located within the Greater Toronto area. One of the things to keep in mind with this temporary public policy is that it does not apply to Quebec. Quebec has its own immigration system, so the refugees that you're sponsoring, or if you're a sponsoring group from Quebec, you cannot, the refugees you're sponsoring cannot settle in Quebec, and if you're sponsors from Quebec, you're not allowed to sponsor refugees under this temporary public policy, because Quebec has its own immigration system. So this temporary public policy applies to all of Canada with the exception of Quebec. Now, the entire group of 5, so all 5 members, or at least 5 members, because you can have more than 5 members in a group of 5, you need a minimum of 5, but you can have a group of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Everybody in the group is collectively responsible for providing financial and settlement support to the refugees when they arrive in Canada for the first 12 months. So for 1 year after the refugees' arrival in Canada, the group of 5, all group of 5 members are collectively responsible for providing financial and settlement support to the refugees. And Helena, in the second half of the presentation, will talk more about your responsibilities as sponsors. So that's what a group of 5 is. So it's a group of 5 or more Canadian citizens, or persons that have permanent resident or Indian status, that are at least 18 years of age, that all live in the same town or city, as well as the same town or city that the refugee will be living in on arrival in Canada, and that is collectively responsible for providing financial and settlement support. Now let's look at what a community sponsor is. A community sponsor is an organization, an association, or a corporation that is either registered for profit or not for profit. So a community sponsor could be a business, it could be a charity, could be a religious organization, it could be a community association, it could be a nonprofit organization. Any organization that is either registered for profit or not for profit can be a community sponsor. The organization has to be located, again, same as with groups of 5, has to be located in the town or the city that the refugees will be living in when they arrive in Canada. So if the refugees intend to live in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, the organization has to be based in Saskatoon. If the refugees intend to live in Calgary, the organization has to be based in Calgary. Now, community sponsors, they can partner with individual co-sponsors or another organization in order to fulfill their responsibilities. And the responsibilities are the same as they are for groups of 5. So the community sponsor, as well as any co-sponsors, have a responsibility for providing financial and settlement support to the refugees for the first 12 months after arrival. Now, one of the key things with community sponsors is, first of all, it needs to be registered. The organization needs to be registered for profit or not for profit. But the other thing is you cannot just set up an organization exclusively to engage or sponsor somebody under this temporary public policy. The organization needs to exist already and have some other activities that it engages in. So, for example, like it's either a business, a charity, a not-for-profit, a religious organization, a community group, or community organization. You cannot set up an organization that specifically does refugee sponsorship as a community sponsor. It needs to have some other activities that it does that is not, so it's not exclusively engaging in refugee sponsorship. So that's who can sponsor under this program: groups of 5 and community sponsors. Now let's talk about the eligibility of sponsors. So if you remember, a group of 5 made up of at least 5 individuals. The community sponsor will have somebody in the organization, the head of the organization, that will be signing the forms. So for groups of 5, as well as the person from the community sponsor that's signing the forms, they have to be 18 years or older. They have to be Canadian citizens, registered Indians, or have permanent resident status. And in the case of groups of 5, all 5 group members must live in the expected community of settlement or have an appointed representative there. In the case of community sponsors, the organization itself must be located in the community of settlement or have a representative there. If you have any criminal convictions and it's been less than 5 years since you completed the sentence, if you're currently detained, if you are in default of any court orders, such as support payments for spouses and children, if you're in default of any previous sponsorships, you are not eligible to sponsor. So when you're forming your group, please make sure the people in your group of 5 or the organization that you may be partnering with, or if you're the head of the organization yourself, please make sure that you are eligible to sponsor. So please make sure everybody in your group is either a Canadian citizen or they have registered Indian or permanent resident status. They are 18 years or older, and they either live in the expected community of settlement in the case of groups of 5, or have an appointed representative there. Or in the case of community sponsors, the organization itself is based in the community of settlement, or there's appointed representatives in the community of settlement, and that nobody has any criminal convictions, or if they do have a criminal convictions, more than 5 years has passed since they've completed their sentence, they're not in default of any previous sponsorships or any court-ordered support payments, and they're not currently in detention. So these are all of the criteria and the requirements for you, the sponsors, as well as your fellow group members.
My name is Helena Shoayi, as Sunit introduced me earlier, and I'll continue from financial and settlement responsibilities of sponsors. So let's take a look at what are the financial responsibilities of sponsors. So when you're sponsoring a refugee, it's important to understand that support must be provided for 1 full year after their arrival in Canada. This support should match the current resettlement assistance program's rate. So I'll be using RAP rates as I continue. So at the time of arrival, that means we have to use the current RAP rates that is in place. By the time they arrive here, we have to use the current RAP rates. So as part of the sponsorship process, you will need to create a detailed budget. So this budget must meet at least the minimum standards outlined in the sponsorship cost table. So there are 2 key parts to include. So the first one is a one-time startup cost. So things like furniture, clothing, any basic household items can be included in that part. And the second one is the ongoing monthly cost, which needs to be covered for a full 12-month period. So this includes, essentials such as housing, which is for rent, food, transportation, and any other daily living expenses. So we will look into a detail of the budget here, the breakdown. So there are certain items to consider when making your settlement budget. So there are, like I mentioned, the one-time startup cost, which sponsors are expected to prepare as soon as the refugees arrive in Canada. So this one-time startup cost intends to cover furniture, winter clothing, and even any other clothes, household effects like kitchen supplies, cleaning products, linens, and school fees and supplies. This applies for those, if you're applying for a family and they have a children between the age of 4 and 21, then you also have to budget for their school fees and supplies. So sponsors must estimate all these items when you are submitting this application to ROCO. So also when you're preparing your settlement plan, you have to estimate how much it will cost you for ongoing monthly cost. So when you're estimating this, you will need to keep in mind that cost of living in the community of settlement and have a more realistic budget. And if your group has, certain items available, you can make donations like shelter, furniture, clothing, household effects, and linen. And also, like I mentioned, if there is any children in that application between the age of 4 and 21, you could also do donation for supplies for those children. So we will look at the sponsorship cost table and the in-kind deduction table in detail in the coming slides. So before we move to the sponsorship cost table and then the in-kind deduction table, I would like to give you a quick reminder. So when you're calculating for sponsorship, you have 2 stages. So sponsors should use the sponsorship cost table. This is when initially when you're applying, submitting your application, you will use the sponsorship cost table to make your calculation. This is to see whether you have the capacity to sponsor based on the sponsorship cost table. For the actual minimum monthly support, you will need to use the current RAP rate. This is when the refugees arrive in Canada, you will be using the RAP rates of the province where the newcomers will be residing. So please remember, the financial support varies depending on the specific needs of the refugees. So this could include their age. If there is a pregnant person in that application, that would also change. If there is a newborn, if there is a disability. So all of that, you will be expected to provide using the current RAP rates at the time of arrival and throughout the sponsorship period. So now let's take a quick look at the sponsorship cost table and how it helps you plan for a settlement budget. If you're a group of 5 or a community sponsor, you will need to use this table when preparing your application. It helps you estimate how much financial support your group needs to provide based on the size of the refugee family you're sponsoring. So for example, if you're sponsoring a single individual, the table gives you a clear estimate of the total cost. This is before any deduction or in-kind donations are factored in. So your group must either show that you have a full amount available at the time of application, or that members of your group can pledge that amount from their income. So this table isn't just for your planning. The Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, or in short ROCO, will also use it when they are assessing your application. So they will refer to the same cost table to check if your group has sufficient funds or income pledges. So they will also review the in-kind deduction table to account for any donations like shelter or furniture. So remember, the sponsorship cost table shows the full amount before those deductions are applied. So it's important to get your estimates right, because both you and ROCO will be relying on this table for budget planning and assessment. Now let's take a look at the in-kind deduction table. So this table shows the maximum deduction you can make from the sponsorship cost table when certain items are already available and you don't need to they don't need to be purchased. So for example, if your group is sponsoring a couple, you have a spare room in your home and you're able to host them for the full 12 months at no cost, you can use shelter as an in-kind contribution. So that allows you to deduct a set amount from your total financial requirement using the in-kind deduction table. But it's very important to note you must have the items available at the time you submit this application. So in this case of shelter, you must already have an extra room ready. You can't plan to move, later or provide to rent a bigger place in the future and still claim that deduction. Only items that are actually in your possession at the time of application can be counted towards in-kind deduction. So if you don't have the items in your possession at the time of submission, then in that case, you cannot use this in-kind deduction table. So again, if you want to see this in-kind deduction table or the sponsorship cost table, please click on the link, the hyperlink below, and you'll be able to see those. So let's just quickly go over financial requirements. So when it comes to funding a sponsorship, it's important to know that the money cannot come from the refugees themselves. The responsibility lies entirely with the sponsorship group. That means your group must already have enough funds to in place to fully support the refugees or refugee family for the entire sponsorship period. You will also need to provide a clear evidence that shows the funds were available and sufficient. So also, I want you to keep in mind that funds from conditional sources like loans or line of credit are not accepted. So the money must be secure and readily available, not dependent on future payments or approvals. Okay, now let's take a look at proof of funds for the application. So both groups of 5 and community sponsors must show that they have enough funds to support the refugees that they are sponsoring. So both types of group can put funds in trust. This is where 2 or more people from the group open a joint account and deposit the funds in that account. So again, when we say trust fund, it doesn't mean like a formal trust fund. It could be a checking or a saving account. Groups can also, contribute from their personal income. This is a pledging option. So minimum of 3 people from the group can pledge for the sponsorship, depending on their income. So there is a calculation where you will find on the application guide. However, if you have any question, you can always reach out to your local RSTP trainer and we will be able to help you with that. And the third option you have is a combination of those 2 options. So you can deposit some of the money in that joint account that you opened, and the rest you can pledge it from your personal income. Same goes for community sponsors. You can deposit the full amount in funds held in trust, or you can contribute from your personal income. So when we say you can contribute from your personal income, it doesn't mean that the community, the organization can pledge from their income. It only applies for individual co-sponsors only. So the third option also is there in the community sponsorship. So you can, deposit some amount in the trust account, and also an individual co-sponsor can pledge from their personal income. Now, how do you show this proof when you are including it in your application package? So if you use funds held in trust, most commonly used documents are a letter from the bank with supporting account statement. So let's say, for example, if the account has been opened for 3 months, let's say you have opened this account 3 months ago, then you have to include a 3 months account statement included in that application, and also explain how funds were gathered and submit evidence. So sometimes people, do fundraising, or people might, contribute to the sponsorship. So if you need to explain, you can write a cover letter and also, add any evidence that shows how the money was gathered. This is just to show that the money is not coming from the refugee. So make sure to have all those information all together with the application package. So if you're also using the pledging from your personal income, make sure to fill out, make sure to include the most recent notice of assessment. That is if you have done your taxes. If you haven't and you have a T4, you could also include that. A T5, a pension statement is also acceptable. And you have to make sure you complete the financial profile form for each person that is pledging or contributing to the trust fund. Okay, now that we understand how we can prove that the funds are coming from the group and also not the refugee, let's understand, or let's talk about the post-arrival support. So what happens once the refugees arrive in Canada? The financial support you provide after arrival is based on the Resettlement Assistance Programs rate, which is the RAP rates. So these rates are set the minimum amount of financial support that must be given to the sponsored refugees. They are used as a baseline to make sure the newcomers' essential needs are covered. So RAP rates are calculated based on the community where the refugees will be living, the size of the family, and the ages of the family members. So to make budget easier, there is an online calculator available on the RSTP website, which is the minimum financial support calculator. So this helps you to estimate how much support will be needed using, the current RAP rates based on your specific sponsorship case. So when you're planning your post-arrival support, make sure you're using the RAP rates as your guide, and refer to the RSTP minimum financial support calculator. Even if you want to do like a manual calculation, the RAP rates are also in our website. So the links are here. So if you download the slide deck, you'll be able to access those informations. So let's take a quick look at post-arrival assurance activities. So as sponsors, you will be working in partnership with IRCC to make sure that newcomers receive all the support they need to settle successfully in Canada. So IRCC may conduct like a routine monitoring, and sometimes they will reach out to newcomers at random to check in and assess the level of support being provided. That's why it's important to keep detailed records of all the support that your group offers. So things like, housing, do they have like a proper housing? Have you been providing that financial support, that monthly support we talked about? Are you taking them to their appointments? Have you enrolled them in, language classes? Are you connecting them with the community? Like any documents that you have, including that financial support, please keep those records, because if you have, in case of those routine monitoring, you will need those documents to present to IRCC officers so that you can prove that the support has been provided. So please make sure you keep those documents. So if you would like more support on this, RSTP also offers, training sessions focused on post-arrival support. and you are all encouraged to attend the sessions for a detailed guidance. So again, if you go on our website, you'll be able to access any training that we have, whether it's post-arrival or even other trainings that we may have. You can just register on our website, and even your local RSTP trainers could be providing a workshop on this. So please look out to your email or even subscribe to our PSR list email. Okay, now let's take a look at settlement support. Just open all of them. So let's go over the key settlement supports your group is responsible for once the newcomers arrive. First, you're going to welcome them at the airport. This is your first opportunity to make them feel, safe and supported. The overall goal is to help them, orientate them to their new life and community in Canada. So make sure there is a temporary housing arranged if needed. If you are renting, think of long-term. Make sure, it's something they can afford even after the sponsorship period ends. Help them apply for provincial health coverage. Ensure they are connected to family doctors as soon as possible. Assist them in applying for Canada Child Benefit and the GST HST credit right after arrival, because these are important financial supports. Also encourage and support them in joining language classes, because these are essential for improving communication, finding employment, and overall, easing their integration. If their social insurance number wasn't issued at the port of entry, help them apply right away, because they will need that even if they're looking for a job. So make sure that is applied as soon as possible. Promote self-sufficiency by encouraging them, job readiness, independence, and community engagement. Also, be sure to offer emotional and moral support, but know your limits when it comes to this. If they have, any mental issues, please make sure you refer them to mental health professionals when needed. And also follow up on their PR card application. This is a key milestone for newcomers, and IRCC expects sponsors to assist with this process. So make sure you follow up with that as well. And also help them open a checking account so you can transfer that financial support, which we talked about, that monthly ongoing support for newcomers. You might also consider opening a savings account to help them, plan for the future, provide financial orientation that's tailored to their experience, and walk them through things like rent payment, bank transfers using ATMs or checks, and also how credit card works, including the risk of misuse. So this also, things that they need orientation in, and also help them to get connected to their local community. This is, any faith groups, support networks, or conversation circles that reflect their background and interest. And finally, connect them with a local settlement agency. So these agencies offer essential services like employment support, language programs, referrals that help, newcomers build a stable and successful life in Canada. So these are not limited to this. Your responsibilities are not limited to this, but these are some of the responsibilities that we have. So when you're filling out the application form, your group will need to complete a settlement plan. This plan should be tailored to a specific needs of the person or a family you're sponsoring, and should reflect the settlement support we just reviewed on the previous slide. There are some minimum settlement supports required in every sponsorship, and you will need a settlement plan checklist. You will have a settlement plan checklist included with the application form to guide you. So the plan also breaks down the support by month across the full sponsorship year. So what you see on this slide is a summary of what should happen in each month. This helps, keep your group organized and on track. So the first one is, this is where a group, like if you're a group of 5, where you just gather and plan how you're going to, fulfill your duties. So you just, talk about what you're going to do as soon as they arrive. And the second one is the arrival stage and the first 3 weeks. So sponsors will receive the refugees and help them with immediate and essential needs. And between month 1 and 3, immediate needs should be addressed. So support, move to orientation, connecting with settlement agencies, and also think of long-term housing for the newcomers. And between month 4 and 6, this is where you think of further settlement support, such as earlier I was looking at a question in the chat that, let's say if the principal applicant is not traveling or the application has a non-accompanying family member, in that case, when the principal applicant arrive in Canada, they can apply for a 1-year window so that they can be reunited with the rest of the family. So this is the time once they, receive their PR and they have all their documentation, then at this time you encourage them to apply for that 1-year window of opportunity. And also see if they've already attended language classes or employment, like whatever it is that you need to do at this point. At least they should be ready for this one. And between month 7 and 9, the support should continue. This is where they start, again, you cannot force them to be independent. However, this is coming to the end of the sponsorship period. So this is the time you see if there are any unmet needs and try to, check those as well. And between month 10 and 12, this is the last phase. This is where they're going to be transitioning to the end of the sponsorship period and transitioning to month 13. So make sure, they're able to get, sustainable housing for them that they can afford and make their transition easier. So we have a training on this on our monthly series, so you can attend for those sessions as well. All right, so we're going to take a look at the application package and how to submit applications. So I don't know if you're aware, but applications are now submitted through the PR portal or permanent residence portal, which is an online system used to submit immigration applications directly to IRCC or Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada. So this portal has been used for other immigration streams, but as of November 2023, it's now also been used for refugee sponsorship applications. So when you're ready to begin your application online, you can follow RSTP's training videos for a step-by-step guidance. There is a link to those videos at the bottom of this slide. We also included a handout called PR Portal Information. It has additional tips and direct links to the training materials. So for now, let's just go over what is included in the application package itself. But however, you can watch those videos on our YouTube channel. All right, so before we get into what is included in one application, let's see things to remember and best practices. So IRCC only processes complete applications. If anything is missing, the entire application will be returned to sponsors without being processed. So to avoid that, make sure you use the document checklist found in the application guide for groups of 5 and community sponsors. So this checklist clearly outlines what's required for your application to be considered complete. So before you hit the submit button, do a final review using the checklist. It's your best tool to make sure nothing gets missed. So also another thing that I would like to remind everyone is that always keep a copy of your application. So there is an option in the portal where you can save the whole application in a zip file. So always remember to keep a copy. In case your application is returned, you'll be able to see what's really missing. I'll continue with things to remember again. The required forms and supporting documents depend on the type of sponsoring group. So whether you are a group of 5 or a community sponsor, the documents you will need may vary. So you have to know the different documentation needs to be included with the application package depending on what kind of sponsors you are. However, the refugee applications forms are always the same, no matter what kind of sponsor is applying. All application must be submitted through the permanent residence portal. Inside the portal, the refugee will complete the generic application form for Canada and the Schedule A, which is the background and declaration form, as part of their application. And once the refugee fills out their online form in the PR portal, the rest of the supporting document also needs to be uploaded into the portal. The sponsors form and documents like the sponsorship undertaking, settlement plan, and financial documents also need to be uploaded into the portal. So it's important to remember that everything, both the refugees and the sponsors application forms and supporting documents, must be submitted together in one complete application package through the portal. So I'm just going to quickly go over how you're going to create your application in the PR portal. So this slide does not look exactly like the PR portal, but it is very similar enough to give you an idea about how you can choose the temporary public policy when you start your application. So when you are in the PR portal and beginning your application, there is a point where you have to select what kind of program you're applying under and also some other details. So you select the details from the drop-down menu. So initially you will choose the permanent residence, including refugee resettlement. Then under the program category, you will choose program refugee. Next, you will choose PSR pathway for Sudan, as you can see on the screen. And finally, you will choose group of 5 or community sponsor under the type of sponsorship group, depending on what type of sponsorship group you are. This is just to give you, some idea about the naming of the program in the portal. Again, if you have never used the portal for the refugee sponsorship application, we have detailed videos on how to create an account, upload documents, and more. So please check the handouts because we have included, this training links and our training videos on our YouTube channel. So please download the handouts so that you can easily access those videos. Now let's take a look at what forms are required for applications. So as a group of 5, you must have the following forms for each application package you're submitting. You'll need sponsorship undertaking and settlement plan form. This is where you input all group members' information and at least 5 sponsors assessment form. This is one for each group member, and a financial profile form for each group member that is contributing financially. That is either the funds held in trust or from their personal income. So if someone is pledging from their income, or if a group member is contributing to the joint account, then in that case, you have to complete the financial profile form. And again, all forms are completed as PDF and uploaded into the portal. This means you will download the forms and fill them out before you upload them into the portal. And another thing that I would like to highlight is that we encourage everyone to use the guide 2200 for groups of 5 if you're a group of 5. So please use the guide so that most of your answers will be answered if you really follow or if you really use the guide, the application guide. Okay, so for group of 5 application to be considered complete, copies of the following supporting documents must be included in each application package. So you need to include proof of Canadian citizenship, Indian status, or permanent residence for each group member. Criminal record check, that is, the check has to be done less than 6 months before the application is submitted. So each group member has to do this criminal record check. And also, you have to include proof of funds, which I already mentioned earlier. You know, if it's applications, if your proof of fund is, you know, if you open a joint account and you can use those, you know, bank documents and everything that I mentioned earlier. And if you're pledging from your personal income, you can include your T4, notice of assessment, and those documents that I also mentioned. And if you want to know the exact documents that you need to include, please click on this hyperlink and it will take you to the application guide. All right, so moving on to forms for community sponsors. As a community sponsors, you must have the following forms, which is again the sponsorship undertaking and the settlement plan form. This is where the co-sponsor, the signing authority's information will be completed, and sponsors assessment form for a signing authority of the community sponsor and each individual co-sponsor or a signing authority of an organizational co-sponsor has to complete sponsors assessment. And financial profile, if an individual co-sponsor is contributing financially, that person also has to complete this form. Like with groups of 5, all forms are completed as PDF and uploaded into the portal. Again, we encourage you to use the guide 2201 for community sponsors to help you with completing these forms. So for community sponsor application to be considered complete, copies of the following supporting documents must be included with each application package again. So proof of community sponsor status, you can click again on this community sponsor status hyperlink. You'll be able to see what kind of documents you need to include. Proof of Canadian citizenship, Indian status, or permanent resident status for the signing authority and co-sponsor has to be also included. Criminal record check that is less than 6 months old for signing authority and co-sponsor has to be included. And also a proof of fund is one of those supporting documents that needs to be included with your application package. So all those supporting documents are uploaded into the portal. So make sure you're not missing any supporting documents when you're working on your application. Now, regardless of the type of group is sponsoring these refugees, the following forms must be included in each application package. We have the generic application form for Canada. This is completed in the portal, so which is going to be completed online. We have the Schedule A. So for each person who's 18 or older has to complete this form in the portal. And we have Schedule 2. Again, each person who's over the 18 and over has to complete this form. So this is not going to be completed online. So you have to download as PDF and complete it and upload it in the portal. So only the generic and the Schedule A are completed online. However, the Schedule 2 needs to be downloaded, completed, signed, and uploaded back to the portal. And again, if you're completing on behalf of the refugees, if you're completing the form on behalf of the refugees, or even the refugees are completing the forms by themselves, please use the IMM 6000 guide. This is also a very important document when you're completing forms to sponsor refugees. All right, so let's go through supporting documents for refugees. So as we discussed with Sunit earlier, we mentioned that for this temporary public policy, refugees don't need to have a refugee status document. However, they need some kind of, their case might prove that they are in a refugee-like situation. And again, if they meet those two classes, they will be eligible to apply. However, if in a regular Group of 5 community sponsorship application, it's a must to submit a refugee status document. If you don't submit this as part of your supporting document, your application will be rejected. And one photo per person has to be included. Let's say if you're sponsoring a family size of 4, and in that case, for 4 person that you're sponsoring, you need to have a picture included with the application. So if you would like to see the specification on the photos, please click on the hyperlink again on the photo that you see on the slide, and you'll be able to see the specification on IRCC's website. And if you have any other supporting documents, like an ID that proves that you're really from Sudan, or any supporting documents that helps your case, please include them with the application package. If you have any travel documents or a passport, please include them with the rest of the application package. And if there are any relevant documents, proof of custody or guardianship, death certificates, divorce certificates, etc. If you have all of those documents and you think it will help your case, please include them with the rest of the application package. All right, now let's get a bit technical here. So these are the documents that you could use to upload on the portal. So you don't need to remember all of these details today. There are instructions in the sponsorship application guide. You can also follow the RSTP training videos we mentioned earlier. So there is a specific section of the application guide that tells you what size and type of files you can upload. So you can upload a PDF file like the sponsorship forms. You can also upload JPEG files, which may be the refugee photos. PNG is another format for pictures. And then if you have any extra explanation or cover letters that you want to include with your application, you can also upload a doc or a docx files, which would be, if you have written something in Microsoft Word or any other word processing application, you can upload those this documents that I just mentioned. If any of this seems confusing, or you're not familiar with this type of document, you can find helpful videos on the RSTP YouTube playlist all about applying through the digital portal. So if you go on our YouTube channel, you will have a playlist that explains everything about what type of files you can upload, and the details will be also in those videos. So again, if you really need any support, you can contact with your local RSTP trainer, or you can call our helpline to ask questions and an actual person can speak to you. So I'll show you our contact information on the last slide, but if you have any questions, again, please just type them in the questions box and we will address them. All right, so let's take a quick moment to talk about signatures. Something small but really important. So IRCC now accepts digital and electronic signatures on documents. If you have worked on a sponsorship application before this year, this might be a new thing to you. So again, this is a recent change. So don't worry, we're just going to explain it. We also have videos that talks about this. So as part of making sure your application is complete, you need to double check that all required forms are signed and that those signatures are recent enough to be valid. So make sure to use the application guide to confirm the exact which exact form needs signature. And another key detail to remember is all sponsorship forms must be signed within 90 days of submission. If signatures are older than that, IRCC may reject the form. So even everything else is in order. If you miss, any signature on the forms, your application will be returned or rejected. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because before the pause of groups of 5 or community sponsor, let's say, for example, you were planning on to submit an application for a family and you have completed the form, the refugee has completed their schedule to, and they have signed it, you've signed your undertaking. Now, now you're ready to submit the application. So let's say if we count from November, it's more than 90 days, right? So make sure to go back, change the date and re-sign it and upload it. So I just want to highlight that because I don't want you to forget. And also you can, ask your local RSTP trainer to help you review your application. And, we will see those, minor things and we'll be able to identify them. All right, so we have come to the end of our presentation. However, we have helpful resources attached to the handout. I hope hopefully some of you have downloaded it. If not, if you're unable, please do let us know and we will send a follow-up email. So as you can see, we have a list of helpful resources that you can benefit from. And also we have a monthly webinar that we provide each month. So please register for those to have a better understanding about the PSR program. We have an online and in-person training sessions offered by regional trainers. So for example, I am located in Winnipeg, and if you need a training, you can, let me know that you would like to be trained. Send me your emails and I will include you in my invites. And if you have any case-specific inquiries, please call the helpline. We're open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Someone will always be there to answer and help you with your questions.
If you do have any more questions, our contact details are on the screen, so please do give us a call. Like Helena and I said, we are here to help, and please use this time to prepare your applications, get in touch with us, ask us questions, because we want to make sure that you're submitting complete applications to IRCC so you have the best chance of ensuring that you're one of the 160 applications that are accepted into processing.